Hi, I'm Jack Cush, executive editor of RheumNow.com. It's 2017, specifically January the 6th, Friday, and this is our first week in review for the new year. We hope you had a great holiday, and we hope you will have a very special and exciting 2017 in the months that lie ahead. We started off this week in 2017 with our number 4,000 tweet on Twitter. I think we've been on Twitter for 5 years now. It's taken us a while to get there, but we thought 4,000 was a sizable number. And we're going to continue to do a lot of tweeting in the months to come. What I've learned is that actually Twitter can be a very useful tool for A, dissemination of information, and B, educating people in 140 characters sort of allotments. So I'd encourage you to sign on to Twitter and follow a few rheumatologists. There's a number of people who put out some very smart stuff, and even a few that put out some entertaining stuff worth watching. So in the last 2 weeks or so, a number of interesting items I'd like to cover today. A study from the Netherlands showed that when analyzing over 40,000 people, they found an incidence of CCP in the population of 1%. Of those people who were CCP positive, only about 1 in 5 actually had rheumatoid arthritis. And when they looked at what led to CCP positivity in the population, it was certainly rheumatoid arthritis, but being older, more likely if you were female, if you were a smoker, more likely if you had joint symptoms, and more likely if you were the first-degree relative of someone with arthritis. So some interesting population data. In 2016, some notable drugs hit the market, none of which were in rheumatology, and new drug approvals were down significantly from 45 in 2015 to only 22 in 2016. Half of these were for orphan drugs, and that's a good news. And the number of new drug applications and BLA applications actually has not gone down. So it was a bit of a down year, at least for rheumatology. That does not include, of course, extensions of new indications on old drugs approved, like uveitis and hidradenitis for adalimumab, or for the approval of the new biologics that are now biosimilars, 3 new TNF inhibitor biosimilars in 2016. Amongst 2687 Finnish patients with rheumatoid arthritis and other inflammatory diseases that led to the use of a TNF inhibitor, this population-based study actually looked at how long patients stayed on drugs, and a surprising number, but one worth repeating, is that only 27% discontinue the drug within 12 months. Now that may be high or that may be low to you, but the numbers have been consistent on studies like this, that over a 4 or 5 year period, again, it's about 10% a year, but it is front-loaded. You lose about 25 to 30% of patients in the first year for a number of different reasons. It seemed in this particular study, discontinuations were higher with infliximab and with certolizumab, and retention was better if patients were on methotrexate. A mechanistic sort of analysis of the study done with mycophenolate and Cytoxan in patients who have systemic sclerosis and interstitial lung disease, looking at those outcomes, looked at biomarkers and actually found that the patients whose interstitial lung disease improved in that study, that it was associated with a decline in the chemokine CXCL4, and that may be important. But then again, that may also be epiphenomenal, and more studies are needed to look at biomarkers, especially in hard-to-treat scleroderma. NICE, the organization in the UK which oversees the availability and use of drugs, especially biologic drugs and new drugs, actually recommended apremilast for approval just recently, and that would affect people in the United Kingdom under the National Health Service who want to treat psoriatic arthritis patients with apremilast. They reviewed all the data. There was a little bit of talk about depression and suicide, and I looked up the data. Actually, their suicide ideation numbers are only 0.2%. Again, I don't know why this particular very safe drug got labeled with depression and suicide, which are very rare events, in my opinion, with this drug. And what does exist is largely a result of the risk that is carried by the underlying condition, psoriasis, which we know does carry a higher association with depression. A very interesting article in the New York Times about the cost of drugs singled out one of our drugs, or one of the drugs that's used in rheumatology, and that being Acthar. The old drug, the old steroid that has a few indications and very little research. The New York Times says is the single most expensive drug per patient used by the Medicare population and paid out by Medicare, where the average payout for this drug was over $162,000 in a year. And when you do the math that it is actually treating 3,100 patients under the Medicare system with that drug, the cost of Medicare is almost $500 million. Not sure why the drug is on the market. I would never use it. There are better alternatives. They need to do more research to prove its efficacy, especially at those prices, which are outrageous. There is a nice review of chronic fatigue syndrome on the CDC website. Unfortunately, it goes on and on and on about chronic fatigue syndrome and myalgic encephalomyelitis, and the abbreviated name for this is ME, myalgic encephalomyelitis / SCFS for chronic fatigue syndrome. And not once in the article does it talk about fibromyalgia. Actually just once, saying it may be associated. It's the same darn condition. I don't know what these people are thinking, but this is what happens when people get carried away. It is fibromyalgia. A systematic review of over 1,000 patients taking the biosimilar CTP13, also known as Remsima or Inflectra, the biosimilar to infliximab, compared to infliximab in IBD, showed no differences in this meta-analysis of over 1,000 patients no differences with regard to efficacy or with regard to safety. A lot of the same data we're seeing in rheumatology. The CDC has actually confirmed that this year's influenza vaccine is the right vaccine, that sporadic reports of the flu strains are actually covered by this vaccine, and encourages people to continue to use it and push for it. You may have heard, of course, that there were 3 biosimilars that were TNF inhibitors approved in the last year. The first to hit the market will be Inflectra, which was supposed to ship in November. It turns out that they started shipping the drug to potential users as of November 21st. They actually have a sales force, and you will be seeing people selling Inflectra. This comes from a subdivision of Pfizer. The name of the company is called Hospira. An interesting analysis study, and I don't know if this is interesting or not, but nonetheless, iron deficiency anemia patients have a 2-fold increase in sensory neural hearing loss. I've never seen the two together, but now I might look for it. News that came out this week about Myriad. Myriad is a company that bought out Crescendo and is the maker of the Vectra DA, MBDA, potential biomarker for use in rheumatoid arthritis. Medicare has issued a negative report about the Vectra test based on a study, the AMPLE study, and questions its potential utility. This, I think, is going to worry people at the company. They'll lead to a lot of shuffling. The test is still available, but this kind of report that's in the news could pose problems for the potential use of that biomarker in 2017. And the last tweet that we had, Incident RA, we talk about this, 1.3 million and somewhere between 0.5% and 1% of the population. A large population-based study said the prevalence was 0.63%. The number of patients who were treated with DMARDs was about 2/3 in the population, but up to 28% were not treated with DMARDs based on claims data. How many were seen by rheumatologists within the first year? The majority, it looked like maybe 2/3 or so, were seen by rheumatologists. 38% were not seen by rheumatologists in the first year, and by year 2 of the disease, 15% had not been seen. So these data suggest that maybe more patients are going to rheumatologists if they have that diagnosis, especially by year 2. We hope that trend continues. A report in today's website about weight loss improving psoriasis. This is a report that we reported on last year that was shown at a dermatology meeting and looked at 60 patients, 56 of whom were randomized to one of two regimens: a control regimen with general information, another one called I think an LED diet, a low energy diet, and looked at the outcomes at 48 weeks and at week 64. And they showed that weight loss, significant weight loss and the average was about 15 kilograms in patients who were on the diet regimen. That weight loss was associated with a significant decrease in the PASI score of -2.3. I think the entry PASI of these people was around 5. And the DLQI, the quality of life measure, also improved -2.3. At week 64, these numbers were maintained. The weight loss was a little bit less, -10.1 kilograms, but nonetheless, the PASI reductions was down even further at -2.9. The DLQI also around -2. Good evidence, not enough evidence like this, showing that weight loss does lead to improved skin disease and psoriasis. There's a smattering of this kind of data in patients with rheumatoid arthritis and other conditions, usually patients undergoing gastric banding or bypass surgery with major weight loss, showing clinical improvement. We know the converse is true, that obesity increases the risk of RA, makes RA worse, impairs responses to both DMARDs and biologics. A nice review in Rheum about pregnancy outcomes in patients with psoriatic arthritis. Very little written about this particular disease when they do get pregnant, and there are a lot of women who are young and of childbearing potential who do get pregnant. Their data was a lot like the RA data. It's not good. It's not 80% of people going into remission. Instead, there was 2/3 of their patients actually had low disease activity prior to pregnancy, and half of those got worse during the pregnancy. Those who had moderate to severe disease stayed moderate to severe. So the bottom line in that particular study was that pregnancy tends to worsen in patients with psoriatic arthritis, and that needs to be discussed with the patient in pre-pregnancy counseling and to discuss the potential drugs that may be used during the pregnancy. A nice review by a large French group that collected all their data and looked at the retrospective renal biopsy results from a cohort of patients with Sjogren's syndrome. In fact, they reported on 95 patients who had biopsy-proven renal involvement. The vast majority of these people actually had tubular interstitial nephritis. That most of those had 75% who had infiltrates with plasma cells, others with T cells and B cells. The finding of SSA positivity in 3/4 or SSB positivity in half the patients was associated with worse findings and a worse prognosis. So I must say I've seen only one good case of interstitial nephritis and Sjogren's in my career, but nonetheless it's something we should look for. A nice analysis of corticosteroid injections of the knee in osteoarthritis patients was published this week in JAMA with an even nicer review by David Felsen discussing the options and the modest benefits. The bottom line is that looking at over 1,700 patients in 27 clinical trials, there's not a lot of evidence that there's any real benefit. All the benefit is very short term, the first 6 weeks, but then when you start looking out months, especially out at 6 months or more, there's almost no benefit to intra-articular injections, suggesting we do need better approaches, and we may want to rethink our use of corticosteroids. I wrote a nice review, I thought so, on proton pump inhibitors and their safety issues. I don't know about you, but my patients are always stopping their PPIs on their own based on something they read, and I wanted to know the data. There's a few good review articles that are cited in the report on the website. And the big issues are, number one, that when you decrease gastric acidity, it may impair drug absorption. Drugs like digoxin and others that require an acidic environment to be absorbed. As a result of this, a number of things happen. There's less calcium being absorbed, and that leads to worsening of osteoporosis and a higher fracture incidence, such that patients on chronic PPIs have somewhere between a 25 and 50% increased risk of fractures. Other issues, magnesium is not absorbed, and hypomagnesemia is also found, an odds ratio of 1.40, and that was significant. The actual numbers would be not so great. It is a 40% increase, but it's not so great when you look at all the patients. Bottom line, though, is that it could lead to major hypomagnesemia and symptomatic hypomagnesemia. So patients on chronic PPI should have their magnesium levels checked. The real concern, I think, comes from, well, another issue actually has to do with a higher risk of C. diff infections. Clostridium difficile colitis is actually higher in patients who are on chronic PPIs. And the last issue are the renal issues, both acute kidney injury, wherein there's almost a twofold increased risk, or actually a 1.5-fold increased risk. And then for chronic kidney disease, there is a 2.5 to 3-fold increased risk. It was even higher, that's compared to the people who are not taking PPIs in large population-based studies. But even when you compare to people who are taking H2 blockers, it still was higher. So you need to watch renal function in patients who are on chronic PPIs. The bottom line is, a lot like nonsteroidals, the short-term use is best, lowest dose possible is best. Patients on chronic use need to be monitored more closely. You probably need to worry more about patients, especially when they're elderly or they have renal disease. A low risk of inflammatory bowel disease with IL-17 inhibition. This was covered by Atul Deodar at the ACR meeting in Washington, where he reviewed almost 5,000 patients treated with secukinumab and showed that the risk of developing colitis was somewhere between 0.1 and 0.77 per 1,000 patient years, highest in patients with ankylosing spondylitis. We know that because they have occult ileal inflammation and occult colitis. But that's the risk for Crohn's disease with secukinumab. It's a bit lower, substantially lower, in fact, for ulcerative colitis. This week in the literature, there was a meta-analysis, or not a meta-analysis, a composite report of the ixekizumab experience, looking at over 4,200 patients treated with ixekizumab, and showed that their risk of Crohn's disease was about 1 per 1,000 patient years, and ulcerative colitis was about 2 per 1,000 patient years. So again, these are very rare events. You may want to avoid IL-17 in those who have a history of colitis, but there's not much else you can do in patients who have no history. So I would use it, and I would watch for it, and then if symptoms develop, aggressively investigate. The CHMP, the part of the EMA, European Medicine Agency, has recommended baricitinib, the next JAK inhibitor, for approval in Europe. That's based on their 5 trials in rheumatoid arthritis. Of course, that's the recommendation by the committee that is usually followed by the EMA. So sometime in 2017, we'll see that. We should also see in the first quarter a recommendation from the FDA about baricitinib's use in the United States. We assume it will be positive based on the data, but who knows? There is not a scheduled hearing by the FDA to review this with the Arthritis Advisory Committee. So the data must be favorable, at least in my opinion, based on that evidence. And lastly, there's a nice report that came out at the end of the year from Johns Hopkins that closes the gap in periodontal disease and the risk of rheumatoid arthritis, specifically looking at the fluid collected from the gingiva in those with periodontal disease, and showing what happens with regard to citrullination of neutrophils, and that there are species in there, Aggregatobacter, actinomycet, I don't know, you're going to have to look it up, AA. It's one of the species that's actually quite capable of producing hypercitrullination of neutrophils, and that may be one of the mechanisms by which periodontal disease may increase the risk of rheumatoid arthritis. Well, that's it for this week, the first week of 2017. You can go to the website and find the links to these articles so you can find more information on these topics. Follow us on RheumNow. We hope we have a great year. See you next week.